When Nazi Germany surrendered in May of 1945, the world turned its eyes to the men who had commanded the most formidable army in Europe. What would happen to the German generals, those who had orchestrated invasions, defended Hitler's empire, and shaped the course of the Second World War? Their fates varied widely. Some were executed, some imprisoned, some quietly lived out their lives in obscurity, and others, remarkably, went on to serve new masters, including the Western Allies and even the Soviet Union. This is the story of what happened to the German generals after World War II. Let's begin with the immediate aftermath of Germany's defeat. When the war ended, the Allies launched a massive effort to track down and capture the military leadership of the Third Reich. Field marshals, generals, and high-ranking staff officers were all seen as potential war criminals. Some surrendered voluntarily, others were hunted down and arrested. A few, knowing what awaited them, chose suicide over capture. Among them was Field Marshal Walter Model, one of Hitler's most trusted defensive commanders, who shot himself in a forest rather than be taken by the Americans. General Oberst Gotthard Heinrich, famed for his defense of Berlin, surrendered without a fight, and of course, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and Colonel General Alfred Jodl, two of Hitler's closest military aides, were arrested and put on trial. The most famous reckoning came at the Nuremberg trials. Here, the Allies prosecuted leading figures of the Nazi regime, including several top generals. The charges ranged from crimes against peace to crimes against humanity to the planning and waging of aggressive war. Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Armed Forces High Command, was found guilty on all counts and hanged in October of 1946. So was Alfred Jodl, Hitler's operations chief, who had signed Germany's unconditional surrender just months before. But not every general met the hangman's noose. Many were instead sentenced to lengthy prison terms. Karl Dönitz, who briefly succeeded Hitler as head of state, received 10 years. Erich Raeder, commander-in-chief of the Navy until 1943, received a life sentence, but was released early due to ill health. Walter von Brauchitsch, commander-in-chief of the army until 1941, died in captivity before facing trial. Yet despite these punishments, a striking number of German generals avoided harsh sentences altogether. Why? Part of the reason lies in the shifting political climate of the late 1940s. As the Cold War emerged, the Western Allies, especially the United States, saw former Wehrmacht officers less as enemies and more as potential assets against the Soviet Union. Many generals argued that they had simply been professional soldiers, not Nazis. They portrayed themselves as men who had followed orders, some even claiming they had resisted Hitler's worst policies. This narrative, sometimes called the clean Wehrmacht myth, proved convenient for both the generals and their new Allied overseers. As a result, numerous officers were released from prison earlier than expected, and some were even recruited into new roles. The most striking example of this was the US Army's employment of German generals as military advisors. One of the best known was Heinz Guderian, the brilliant armored warfare commander often credited with developing blitzkrieg tactics. Though initially detained, Guderian was never charged with war crimes. By the 1950s, he was writing his memoirs and advising NATO on tank warfare. Another was General Franz Halder, former chief of the Army General Staff. After spending time in prison, he was employed by the US Army Historical Division, where he oversaw thousands of pages of German military history. His work deeply influenced Western understanding of the Eastern Front, though it often downplayed German atrocities and exaggerated Soviet brutality. The Americans even formed what was known as the Historical Division, which relied heavily on German officers to write detailed studies of their wartime experiences. Generals like Erich von Manstein, who had commanded at Stalingrad and in the Crimea, contributed to these works. Manstein himself was tried by the British for war crimes, convicted, and sentenced to 18 years. Yet he served only 4, and by the 1950s, he was a free man, advising West Germany's new army. Yes, remarkably, many German generals went on to serve again, in the Bundeswehr, the armed forces of West Germany, founded in 1955. With NATO eager to strengthen Western Europe's defenses against the Soviet Union, experienced German commanders were seen as valuable resources. Adolf Heusinger, a former general staff officer, rose to become Inspector General of the Bundeswehr and even chairman of NATO's military committee. Hans Speidel, once a Wehrmacht officer and later associated with the July 20th plot to kill Hitler, became NATO's commander of land forces in Central Europe. Even men who had stood trial for war crimes were quietly rehabilitated. Hasso von Manteuffel, a famed panzer commander, entered politics and served as a member of the West German parliament. Albert Kesselring, the Luftwaffe Field Marshal convicted of atrocities in Italy, had his death sentence commuted and was released in 1952, later writing memoirs that shaped public perceptions of the war. Not all generals ended up in the West. In the Soviet Union, captured German officers faced a very different fate. Thousands were taken prisoner, including high-ranking figures like Friedrich Paulus, commander at Stalingrad. Paulus, who had surrendered his Sixth Army in 1943, lived in Soviet captivity for years. He later testified against his former comrades at Nuremberg, condemning the Nazi regime. Some generals in Soviet hands became members of the so-called National Committee for a Free Germany, a propaganda group that encouraged Wehrmacht soldiers to defect. Yet most endured long years of imprisonment, with many not returning home until the mid-1950s. Generals in Soviet captivity often lived out their final years under suspicion, seen as tainted by their cooperation with the communists. Others met more tragic ends. Some, like Generaloberst Hans Valentin Huber, had died during the war. Others, like Erwin Rommel, had been forced to commit suicide by the Nazi regime itself. But after the war, suicides continued. Faced with humiliation, fear of trial, or a life behind bars, a number of German generals chose death over justice. Still others faded into obscurity, living quietly in post-war Germany or Austria. Many wrote memoirs, which often painted themselves as brilliant soldiers betrayed by Hitler's poor decisions. These works, widely read in the 1950s and 60s, helped shape popular memory of the war, sometimes more than the actual historical record. And so, the legacies of these generals became complicated. On one hand, many were undeniably skilled military commanders. Their tactical and operational insights were studied by NATO and the Warsaw Pact alike. On the other hand, their participation in a brutal war of aggression, one that involved mass atrocities, forced labor, and the destruction of entire nations, could not be ignored. Some, like Keitel and Jodl, paid with their lives. Others, like Manstein and Kesselring, faced conviction but were ultimately released, their reputations partially rehabilitated. Still others, like Guderian and Speidel, found new careers in the armies of democratic Europe. The Cold War, more than anything, shaped their fates. What mattered most was not what they had done under Hitler, but what they could contribute in the struggle against the Soviet Union. By the time the last surviving generals died in the 1970s and 80s, a remarkable transformation had taken place. The very men who once led Hitler's armies across Europe had, in some cases, been embraced as allies of the West. Their writings filled bookshelves, their advice shaped NATO strategy, their myths influenced generations of historians and military officers. But history is not so easily rewritten. Today, scholars emphasize the responsibility these generals bore, not only for the campaigns they fought, but for the crimes committed under their command. The clean Wehrmacht narrative has been dismantled, replaced with a fuller, harsher truth. In the end, the story of Germany's generals after World War II is one of survival, reinvention, and uncomfortable compromises. They were men caught between defeat, justice, and the shifting needs of a divided world. Some were punished, some were forgiven, and some, astonishingly, returned to power. But all of them lived with the shadow of the war they had helped to fight, a shadow that still lingers over history to this day. Thanks for watching till the end. If you like this video, make sure to share, like and subscribe to not miss any new history videos.